Hey, this is The Campaign Moment. I'm Aaron Blake. We're doing an extra episode this week now that we've had the first couple days of testimony in Donald Trump's Manhattan criminal trial. Bonus episodes like this are something we're going to do whenever something big pops up. Today, we're talking about that Manhattan case and the early signs of how it might be impacting Trump's 2024 campaign. And for that, I'm joined by someone who knows this case inside and out and has for the better part of 6 years, Ros Helderman, who is a senior national investigations editor here at The Post. Ros, welcome.
Hi, Aaron. How are you?
I'm doing great. So, Ros, you were someone who actually started on covering this case when it first broke in 2018 with the initial Wall Street Journal story and then a whole lot of disclosures throughout that year. As this trial has started up, Ros, I wanted to ask you, how clear is your memory of these things that happened 6 years ago, and how much are you being reminded of things that you've long forgotten about?
Yeah, it's funny. If you had asked me in 2018 of all the things that we were covering at that time, all the different Donald Trump scandals that happened then, and then honestly in the years between then and now, scandal after scandal after scandal, if you had said, which of these things is likely to be the one that, in the year 2024, everyone is sitting in a courtroom for the first ever criminal trial of a former president of the United States, I don't think I would have necessarily guessed the hush money payment to Stormy Daniels. And it is funny that so much was happening then that my memories of how we first learned about this case and how it unfolded, it takes me a minute to try to remember back. I mean, I do remember when it first broke, Michael Cohen denied that Donald Trump had been the one to make the payment. And each of those things, like happens so much with Donald Trump, each of those things in turn, as we learned them, were shocking at the time. It was shocking that Michael Cohen had actually made a payment to her prior to the election to buy her silence. And then it was shocking when they admitted that actually he had been reimbursed by Donald Trump. So a lot of those things are fuzzy in my memory. Some of them have been, refreshed for me, as the lawyers say, in the last year since Trump was indicted in this case. But some of them, I think, will be all sort of reminded of together as this parade of witnesses takes the stand to tell us about this case and what happened day by day in this New York courtroom.
Yeah, no, I think the lesson there is we focus a lot on where polls are of how people view the hush money case and how serious a crime they think it is. But back in 2018, when this whole thing first started, there was a significant degree of concern in the American public about this. I remember an AP poll that showed 8 in 10 people thought that Trump had at least done something unethical with regard to the hush money payments. So this was a pretty significant thing back then. And I just think that as we kind of walk through these things that we may have forgotten about and are becoming new again, if that might just remind people of certain things that maybe they had forgotten about but didn't like in real time. Which also brings me to the kind of nickname that we have for this trial, and that's the runt of the litter. Some legal experts will talk about it like that. Even Trump-critical ones suggest that this is not the weightiest of matters, especially relative to the other Trump indictments that we're talking about. I wondered if I could just kind of get your take on how significant this is relative to the other cases, both when it comes to the substance of the charges and then also politically.
Yeah, what happens when you get into a courtroom is that all the issues narrow down to the simple question of legal versus illegal, right? But in a campaign, there's a lot of other considerations to take into account: ethical and unethical, and feels good and feels icky, and sort of leadership qualities, what people want in a leader and what they don't want in a leader. And so I think the runt of the litter concept comes from two different things. One is the actual sort of substance of the legal case, right? This is a case in which Donald Trump is charged with an illegal act that would ordinarily be a misdemeanor, so not a very serious crime in the context of the criminal code, and has been elevated to a felony in this sort of bank shot way where the misdemeanor of falsifying a business record that's been turned into a felony because it was done, the prosecutors say, to cover up another crime, but that other crime isn't charged, so it's sort of confusing. And then in the context of the other cases he faces, the underlying conduct is paying off a porn star. It's not trying to overthrow a democratic election. It's not hoarding and keeping for himself the nation's most sensitive national security secrets. So that is where that comes in. Now, that isn't to say that voters, upon being exposed to 6 weeks of coverage of this trial, won't say, hi, I've sort of not really thought in a while about the fact that the former president of the United States, was accused of having a sexual liaison with a adult film actress while his wife had just given birth and then paid her off $130,000 so that she wouldn't tell the American people about that before the last election. I hadn't really focused on that one in a while, and maybe I don't really love that when I think about it, but we'll have to see over time.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we need to do, and you were right about this, is like separating the legally problematic from the politically problematic. Like, is this the case in which Trump is going to be sentenced to years and years in jail? I would think that most people would think that's not going to be the case. And the legal theory here, too, is novel and the bank shot that you referenced here. So actually proving the case is going to be difficult. But when it comes to like the actual substance of a thing that happened, the hush money payment to an adult film actress is like something that can get people's attention. In a way, it's a less esoteric thing than classified documents and whether this is illegal or not. Like
Yeah. And it's very understandable, right? Like, even looking at the first witness who's taken the stand this week is David Pecker, who used to run the National Enquirer, a publication that many Americans have some at least passing familiarity with. And the thing he's been talking about on the stand, which, we certainly knew, but maybe some people didn't know or don't remember, this will be a reminder of it, was that he and Donald Trump made an agreement during the campaign in 2016, a really pretty extensive and, at the time would have been shocking agreement that he was going to use this supermarket tabloid to boost the campaign of one presidential candidate. And they then did it. They talked all the time about this, about burying stories that would be bad for Donald Trump and also running stories that would hurt his opponents. I mean, there was all this coverage, dirty coverage of Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and then, of course, Hillary Clinton when she was the Democratic nominee, cover after cover in the National Enquirer. And that was all done as part of an agreed upon scheme between these two guys that the National Enquirer, of all things, was going to be used to help elect Donald Trump president. Can the prosecutors prove that's part of an illegal scheme? We will see. But, Americans may be discomforted by that idea.
Yeah, and I think the Pecker testimony here is key because while he wasn't specifically involved in the Stormy Daniels payment, a big part of this is like proving that this was actually related to the campaign. If you look back at how, we talked about how Trump kind of he lied about this early on and the denials shifted over time. When it finally came out and he had to concede that he had some kind of involvement in this scheme, he basically said, well, yeah, that's true, but this wasn't about the campaign. He called it a, quote, simple private transaction. He said it wasn't a campaign violation because the money didn't come out of his campaign. It can still be a campaign violation even if it doesn't come out of his campaign. The key here is whether this can be tied to that campaign, right? This is what takes it from a misdemeanor to a felony, because the theory of the prosecution is he was falsifying these business records in relation to an effort to influence the election, to prevent people from getting this information. And so I think Pecker's testimony was significant on that front. Pecker said, Trump asked me what I can do and what my magazines can do to help his campaign. He said that he told Trump that he would be his eyes and ears because he hears a lot of stuff that's going around. And then there were multiple instances in his testimony where he referenced the idea that, Michael Cohen at least really wanted these stories buried, but especially after the election. I think that was kind of the significant thing for me because it shows that this wasn't just about Trump's personal reputation. It was also about preventing voters from getting this kind of information ahead of that election day. Can you just kind of talk about, the line between campaign related and personal is here?
Sure. Well, so there's some historical precedent to this being a really important piece of a case like this. People may or may not remember the John Edwards case. Senator from North Carolina ran for president as a Democrat who had arranged for payments to be made to a woman who worked with his campaign with whom he fathered a child. And he was charged with making illegal campaign contributions to her. So, kind of not exactly parallel facts, but somewhat similar. Someone running for president sending money off to a woman to try to hide the relationship that he had with her. And in that case, he was acquitted. Actually, one of the final stories I did before I became an editor, back when I was a reporter long ago, a year ago, I did a story about that case and how it compared to this one, to the Trump case. And I talked to the man who had been the foreman of that jury. And one of the things he talked about was they acquitted in part because they were not fully convinced by the prosecution that the money that had been paid in that case was really about the campaign. They were persuaded that John Edwards was trying to hide this affair from his wife and that he had a sort of network of wealthy friends who were also campaign donors who were willing to help him, and that the money was much more about hiding this personal dalliance from people in his life than it was about the campaign. So I think that's the narrative that the prosecution is trying to refute in this case. The facts on that particular front, I think, are better for them. Among other things, the relationship with Stormy Daniels, I hesitate to call it a relationship. It was a single sexual encounter.
Allegedly.
Allegedly, I'm sorry, that he denies. She said it had taken place years and years before this. And so, the need to pay her in October of 2016 for something that happened in 2006, it's much easier to draw the connection to the campaign. And of course, we are going to have Michael Cohen testify. Michael Cohen, the longtime Trump lawyer and confidant, who is the one who actually made the payment and then was reimbursed by Trump. He, of course, is going to testify that it was absolutely about the campaign, that they had conversations about that, and that was the intention. Though, of course, Trump is going to say that he is a liar.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit more. But before we do that, let's take a quick break here. When we come back, we'll actually bring in some polling on this subject.
Ooh, polling. I'm excited.
Polling. All right, Roz, I wanted to actually pick up on the point we were just talking about, which is the kind of choice between this being about the campaign, this being a personal expense, which is going to be a significant subject of this trial. And I think it's also significant politically in addition to legally. And I'll tell you why. And this is one of the kind of most interesting polls that I've seen on this subject. It comes from YouGov, and they've been asking this question for a while, actually dating back in 2018, actually. And the question they ask doesn't mention Donald Trump. It just asks if it is a crime to pay someone to remain silent about an issue that may affect the outcome of an election. It's been really interesting because Republicans, like back in 2018, they didn't really agree with that. And then they really agreed with it before the indictment because they didn't realize it was about Donald Trump. And then the number went down again. But the most recent poll on this subject showed that 7 in 10 Americans agree that what I described is a crime, to pay someone to remain silent about an issue that may affect the outcome of an election. That's significant to me because whether you think this is a runt or anything else, it suggests to me that if they can drive home the idea that this was about the campaign, if that's established in this case, both legally and otherwise, this is something that could potentially matter to people because they'll see it as being a bigger deal than just the falsification of a few financial documents that were crafted back in 2016 and 2017. So that's kind of why I think that this is not just a legal issue. It's also a key kind of threshold issue for voters more broadly that could impact the 2024 election.
I think you just made a really good point. Can I just tell you I find that polling question annoying? This isn't the question that you asked me, but I don't know. I find it annoying to ask people, is something a crime? It either is a crime or it's not. That's based off of the laws that have been passed and is ultimately determined by a jury. You can ask them, should it be a crime?
Yeah.
Should it be a crime is a fine question, but that's just me. I'm not a pollster, so
Yeah, I think this is where you and I, like, our perspectives like differ a little bit. Like, yes, something is either a crime or it's not a crime, but also it matters what people perceive to be a crime. And maybe like this question to people is really about, this is a substantial crime. Like, this matters enough to me that I can see this being truly objectionable conduct if it's in fact intended to affect the outcome of the election. So I think your point is well taken that, like, whether people think it's a crime doesn't actually impact whether it's a crime, but it's kind of a reflection about their broader feelings about the subject. And that's kind of where I think that this could wind up actually mattering, even as these people on the American public aren't actually serving on the jury and deciding whether this is a crime or not.
I take your point and I understand it. I would like for us as a society to move away from encouraging people to think that it's like a matter of opinion whether or not something is a crime. But anyway.
Yeah. Roz, we've got basically one full day of testimony in this case now. There's a long way to go here. I wondered, what are the witnesses that you are most looking forward to as, kind of driving home this case and being the potentially decisive one moving forward?
Yeah, I think there's going to be a few real highlights. One is going to be Michael Cohen, who is someone the public is pretty familiar with, although has kind of stepped out of the sort of limelight for the last couple of years. One of those moments that seemed so important at the time, but maybe people have forgotten now, that moment where he dramatically went before Congress and testified about Donald Trump, including about this Stormy Daniels payment. It was an all-day thing. Everyone watched. It was really a big deal at the time, and now I think people have largely forgotten about it. But now we're going to get him and Donald Trump in the same room, staring each other down. Cohen talking about all these things that happened and how he viewed Trump and how he views him now, while his old mentor, boss, person he adored, idolized, sits there a few feet away. It's really going to be quite a moment. We're also going to have Stormy Daniels herself, the adult film actress, who I imagine will take the stand and testify about getting this money, maybe about the encounter with Donald Trump. So that's going to be quite a dramatic moment. And then, of course, there's Donald Trump himself. He has claimed, at least to reporters, that he wants to testify. I think the standard legal advice, particularly for someone with such a tenuous hold on the truth as Donald Trump, would be that it is a bad idea to take the stand. But ultimately, he gets to run his own defense, and so he may well testify himself. So those, I think, are the biggest sort of testimonial moments that we have to look forward to. I would also just say, and, I defer a little bit to you, Aaron, on what you think the politics of this have been so far and what they will be going forward. I do think there's a sort of vibiness to this, that Donald Trump has to go to court every day and sit there in that courtroom silently glaring while he's scolded by the judge and people say things about him that aren't very nice, and he has to sit there and take it. I don't know. There is a sort of sense that this may be like a little diminishing to him at this time when he should be running for president and out in front of screaming fans at rallies. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's a really good point. And it's not just like having to sit there for hours on end and dozing off from time to time, apparently. It's also just like sitting in front of people who are talking about you in this way. Last week, he had to listen to these jurors go through their social media posts, which were, in a lot of cases, unfriendly to Donald Trump. He's going to have to relive this very personal episode that I'm sure his family does not like hearing about. It's all a very sensitive subject. It's all a very unpresidential thing to have to sit through this. And it's also a long time for this to go on, for him to put up with that. And we've all seen how he's not maybe the best client for a lawyer with the things he says on social media and his comments outside the courthouse. So what are the odds that he can even maintain kind of a modicum of discipline throughout the course of this in a way that doesn't hurt him in some way? So I think that's a really big question moving forward. And I also think, the Cohen stuff is going to be fascinating. And I think this is the testimony on which I really wish that we had cameras in the courtroom. I wish we had it in all of these cases, and I think it would be fascinating and it would be better for people consuming this news. But like the dynamics between Trump and his former lawyer taking that stand, it'd be something that I would like to at least like have a video after the fact so I could look at it.
You do not get cameras, but you do get the crack Washington Post trial team. We will have multiple reporters in both the courtroom and the overflow room in New York running our live coverage and, describing every tick of both men's faces and everything they say. So thankfully, we've got that.
And that's a good reminder for everybody to subscribe to the Washington Post. You can find a link in our show notes. And also make sure that you subscribe to this podcast, The Campaign Moment, on our own feed, which is the only place that you can find these bonus episodes, which we could be having more of as this trial progresses. That's it for this bonus episode of The Campaign Moment. Roz, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you for having me.
Roz Helderman is the Senior National Investigations Editor for The Post. Today's episode was produced by Ted Muldoon and edited by Renita Jablonski. We'll be back in your feed this Friday with our regularly scheduled episode. I'm Aaron Blake. Thanks for joining us.